Hello again, and welcome back to the Ramsay Online Lecture Series for 2021. I'm Simon Haynes, and my guest today really needs very little introduction as she is rejoining us by popular demand. Professor Bettany Hughes, the award-winning historian, classicist, author, and broadcaster, spoke to us last year, you'll remember, about the Odyssey. And the lecture had so many online hits on our website that we asked her if she could do another one for us. And she very kindly agreed. The result, as you will see, is another treat. This time based on her third book, Istanbul, A Tale of Three Cities, published 3 or 4 years ago. Bettany Hughes has written and presented over 50 TV and radio documentaries for the BBC, Discovery Channel, PBS, the History Channel, and National Geographic. Her programs have now been seen by over 250 million people worldwide, including, you can catch her on our very own SBS. Her 2 BBC Open University series on Socrates, the Buddha, and Confucius, and on Freud, Nietzsche, and Marx can now be seen on Netflix, and they are called Genius of the Ancient World and Genius of the Modern World. She won a top international prize for promoting public awareness of cultural heritage in 2018, and Bettany Hughes was the first woman ever to receive this award. And just 2 years ago, she was awarded the OBE for services to history. And indeed, 2 recurring themes in Bettany's career have been to draw attention to the role of women in society throughout history and to promote the study of classical languages and civilizations in schools. And so, to today's lecture. At Ramsay, we often like to point out to school and university students that the word civilization is derived from the Latin word for city, and in fact from a much older Proto-Indo-European word for settlement or home, that is, as opposed to a nomadic existence. And we also point out that the 3 great originary cities of Western civilization are Athens, Rome, and indeed Istanbul, otherwise known as Byzantium or Constantinople, the capital of both the Eastern Roman Empire and then later the Ottoman Empire. So this is perhaps the greatest of all hybrid cities. Its very name is a Turkish assimilation of the original Greek Eistein, to the city. So here is Bettany Hughes to tell us all about this unique cosmopolis, which means world city, or metropolis, which means mother city, or as she calls it in the title of today's talk, the Queen of Cities. But also bearing in mind that last time Bettany talked about an extraordinary man, this time she will introduce us to an extraordinary woman, another queen, indeed an empress. So here is Bettany Hughes.
Hello, everybody. How brilliant to be with you tonight. Thank you so much for tuning into this lecture. I wish I could be with you in person. Everything crossed, we'll be able to meet and mingle again next year, even if not in a few months' time. So I'm talking tonight about Istanbul, a city that's been described as the world's desire, the queen of cities, the greatest city on earth. And I should just warn you that I am a historian, but I'm going to throw out some of my historical neutrality and put my neck out and say, actually, of all the extraordinary cities on earth, there is a reason why Istanbul has been given these incredible titles. And I'll tell you what I think it is. It's not just because of its extraordinary, deep historical experience, something which stretches back 800,000 years. It's not just because of its architectural and artistic wonders. And oh my goodness, those are there. I've just landed, I've got a bit of a tan because I've just landed from Istanbul. And as ever, I was blown away by the extraordinary variety of historical and artistic heritage that's available there. It's not just because of that. And it's actually not just because it's a city that has always been relevant to politics, east and west, north and south over the last 2,500 years, and is continually racing up the political agenda. It took me 10 years to write my book on Istanbul, and every time I had to rewrite the foreword and conclusion because there was so much going on there in political terms. It's not just because of those things. I think it's because it's a city that has enjoyed such an incredible breadth and mix of the human experience. It's a place where people have crossed borders and boundaries to meet together, to discuss and to evolve and to express what it is to be cultured, what it is to have a civilization. That actually it's a city that holds up a mirror to our own experience. It helps us to understand why we are as we are as humans, and also critically what it takes to make a city, and more than that, what it takes to be able to live successfully in a city together. So as you can tell, I'm a huge fan of the place, and what I'd love to do is to talk about the city, in particular looking at some of the incredible archaeological discoveries that there have been made there over the last 10 years, because it really is a city, as it's creating its future as a new world-class city, more and more excavations are happening in the city itself, and its deep and incredibly sophisticated past is being revealed. So I'm going to share some of those new archaeological discoveries with you. But just before I started, I just wanted to share a little story. So I've been going to Istanbul since I was 18. I fell in love with the city 35 years ago. And I've always taken my daughters back there, you know, as you can imagine, brilliant as they are. Sometimes when they were teenagers, you know, their shoulders would go down a little when I announced we were going on yet another kind of 3-week walking historical tour of a great city such as Istanbul. But we were there one time and I said, okay, I'm going to mix things up a bit. Rather than just walking around the city, let's cross the Sea of Marmara to go on the trail of the brilliant Empress Theodora. Now, you're going to be hearing more about Theodora today, but she is truly a remarkable character, a woman who rose right from the bottom of the pile 1,500 years ago to become the Empress of the Great Byzantine Empire, an empire that spanned 1,000,000 square miles. So she is the very incarnation of social mobility. But Empress Theodora, back in the 6th century AD, was very keen on baths, on hot baths. And we know that she used to travel from what was then the city of Constantinople, because of course, this is a city with at least 3 names: Istanbul, Constantinople, Byzantium. This is the medieval period of the city when it was known as Constantinople. She leaves Constantinople and travels across the Sea of Marmara to Asia, to a beautiful city called Prusa, which is now called Bursa, up high on the hills in Anatolia. And she went there because there are hot springs and she wanted to take a bath. Now, 2 things very interesting to know about this trip. One is because she was a woman who had risen from absolute rags to riches. When she traveled, she really wanted people to know that she was traveling to take a bath. So she traveled with a retinue of no fewer than 4,000 people. So it was quite an expedition. But also, very sadly, we think one of the reasons later in her life she was so keen on going and taking hot baths was because she almost certainly died of breast cancer in her late 40s. And there's a possibility that an operation on her is the first example of a mastectomy in the medieval world. So it could be that she was just trying to relieve herself of the pain of that cancer. But anyway, Theodora went. And I traveled with my daughters and said, let's go in the footsteps of this incredible, mighty, powerful, extraordinary woman, to go to find her baths. So we traveled across the Sea of Marmara, went to the baths, which are still standing and are still in use. Unfortunately, the section where Theodora would have bathed was at that time a male-only section. So I had to kind of peep in, looking slightly strange in this male-only bath, much to the embarrassment of my daughters. But it was an incredible thing to go there and to kind of walk in the footsteps of history, because I certainly find that I can't write about history, I can't understand it unless I go to the place where it happened. So we experienced this sort of medieval wonder of these baths with this incredible woman, travelled back to Istanbul. And on the ferry on the Sea of Marmara, they always have these television's playing with the news, and the city that we'd left in peace was on fire. So these were the Gezi Park protests, the Taksim Square riots of 2013. There were cars turned upside down, there was flame everywhere. And it was an incredible moment for me, that, because I know that as a city, it is a very protean and pyretic place. It's a place that constantly changes and reinvents itself, and a city where people often take to the streets in order to make their opinions held. It's almost a city which has such an extraordinary character in and of itself, such a sense of itself. It's so geographically extraordinary. You know, the old city of Istanbul sits on this kind of rhino horn of land that reaches out into the Sea of Marmara and the Bosphorus, with the Golden Horn behind. That it exists as a character in and of itself. But of course, a city is nothing other than the people who live within it. There's a beautiful quote that says that a city is made of the mood of the men and the women within it. So in order to understand Istanbul, I need to understand the people who live there. And that's what I'm going to do through archaeology, go on the trail of the citizens of this great city of Istanbul. So if we could just have the first slide, please. This is the book I've written on Istanbul. And as I was saying, when I came back from that trip across the Sea of Marmara, the city had suffered protests and riots. And one of the bits of graffiti that had been written up on a shopping window said, "Istanbul, Constantinople, Byzantium, Bizim is ours," which means this is a city that is connected across time by place. It's a city that belongs to the people of Istanbul, whatever the time and place. So it was a really interesting for me to see this incredible bit of historical graffiti on a wall. So this is a city where the people of the city really matter. So I want to take you right back to the prehistory of the city. And if we look at the next slide, you can see this rather extraordinary shape. Now, very uncharitably, when I was showing this recently in Oxford, somebody said to me, "Is that an avocado holder?" No, it is not an avocado holder. It's something far, far more exciting than that. What you're looking at is a footprint which has been left in the mud around the kind of prototype settlement that was one of the very first settlements in the area of Istanbul. And it was left 8,000 years ago. So that is an 8,000-year-old footprint that you're looking at. And there are thousands of these, of men, of women, of children, some barefoot, some wearing little leather slippers. So what you're looking at are the first inhabitants of this city. And this was an incredible time and place. It was a time where it was very water-based. We know that people used canoes to get around. And indeed, in the same archaeological dig, the world's first wooden canoe paddle was found, with all kinds of other things like beautiful spoons made of wild cow bone, and in fact the world's oldest wooden coffin, which has a woman aged 35 or so curled up and buried in it in a sort of fetal position. So 8,000 years ago, there was a vigorous settlement here. And in some ways, it must have been rather idyllic. Again, analysis has been done, and there were 9,000 species of flora in this area. So people would wake up in the morning 8,000 years ago and breakfast off pistachios from the pistachio forests that were there, or from the fig forests. There were oak trees too. So it was a very, very beautiful place. But then 5,500 BCE, there is a trauma, a massive geoseismic event that changes the story of Istanbul, that both destroys lives, but also really forms the city as the world-class, world-connecting city it will be. Because in 5,500 BCE, there is a massive change in water levels. Over 300 days, the water levels rise by about 238 feet. So just wrap your heads around the maths of that. We're worried about sea level rises now. That's an exponential rise. and 10 cubic miles of water come pouring over a landlip to create what is now the Bosphorus, that incredible stretch of water that connects north and south, east and west on the edges of Istanbul. And you can see that on the next slide. The Bosphorus is now created, and around about I've marked the prehistoric settlements there are in the area of Istanbul. So huge areas are flooded, about 600 square miles are flooded, and we know that people lost their lives. We have evidence of their settlements on the seabed and on the bed of the Black Sea, for instance, around there. And also really fascinating, just in 2011, an amazing bit of research was done that shows that underneath the Bosphorus, there is a submerged subterranean river, a freshwater river, which partly explains the incredible push and pull of currents on that 20-mile stretch. If you travel up and down the Bosphorus, the water direction changes around 9 or so times. The currents are very difficult to cope with, to navigate. It's a very difficult stretch of water to navigate. But I almost think that the Bosphorus, as well as defining the city as a place that both separates and connects east and west, and critically separates and connects north and south, because at the top end of the Bosphorus is the Black Sea. Beyond that is what is now Russia. At the bottom end of the Bosphorus is the Sea of Marmara. Beyond that, the Hellespont, that then connects to Crete and to the northern coast of Africa. As well as being a great connector, it's a very, very dynamic body of water. It offers both promise and peril in equal measures. And that kind of feels to me the same as Istanbul. It's this very dynamic city that you always have to approach on the front foot. It's a city that attracts you, that lures you in, but is not a comfortable city. It's a city that has real brio and brilliance. It's a city of dynamism. So the city is created in the form that we know, with this incredible Bosphorus water. And actually, if you understand the city of Istanbul, you have to understand it as much as a place of seas and waters as a place of land. And indeed, it was described later on as a city that was a diamond surrounded by 2 sapphires, the waterways, and emeralds. So it's a city where water really matters, but it's a city whose story is constantly evolving. Just when I was writing the book, in the western edge of Istanbul, if we could have the next slide, please, there was a new discovery of a tomb from 4,000 years ago, which is this very fascinating kurgan-shaped tomb, again with a human inhabitant, again curled up in a fetal position. And this is interesting because this shows us that there was some influence from Central Asia in the city of Istanbul way, way before the Greeks arrived. Because some of you will know, I write a lot about ancient Greece. I'm a great fan of what the ancient Greeks did. But my goodness, they invented the term history, and they are very good at writing themselves into history. And the Greeks tell us that they founded the great city of Byzantium, that they sailed out from the Greek mainland, from Megara, originally went to Chalcedon on the Asian Anatolian side, which was then described as the city of the blind, because they missed the fact that Byzantium was opposite them, and then went and founded the city of Byzantium. If we could have the next slide, please. The Greeks are very definitely there. There is no doubt that they turn up, and they start to build very typical Greek things. I've just shown you a kind of amalgam picture here of some of the Greek and Roman period constructions in the historic centre of what is now Istanbul. So they build things you'd expect. There comes to be a hippodrome in Roman times. There's a forum. There are great temples to the great gods. But really interestingly, it seems that the Greeks communicated and adapted with the local population. Very recently, an inscription has been analysed, in fact, at Delphi, and it comes from Byzantium, and it's written in a combination of Greek and a kind of local Thracian Byzantine dialect. So I don't think there was a kind of grand invasion of virgin territory. We know that wasn't the case from the archaeology. I think probably the Greeks came as traders, not as raiders, and settled probably peacefully on this kind of, as I said, rhino horn of land. And there was a bit of a kind of mingling and melding with the local Thracian population, but the local Thracian population was definitely there before the Greeks. And if you look at the Greek history of the city there, it's almost as if they can't quite kind of Doric column out the easternness of the place. So along with the Greek gods that you'd expect to be worshipped there, Apollo, Aphrodite, the hero Heracles, for instance, there are a number of Eastern-facing Asian gods. Isis from Egypt is worshipped in the city, as is this incredible woman, Cybele. So if we can just have the next slide, please. This is a Roman period representation of Cybele. Now, Cybele was a goddess who we think originates in Anatolia, is what are now the kind of Asian side of Istanbul. My goodness, she is a goddess not to be messed with. She's a nature goddess, a creature who's in charge of life and death. She's worshipped in these incredible mountain shrines in central and western Turkey, where her image is cut into the rock face itself, as if she's controlling the entry between the living world and the world of the dead. She's a mistress of animals. She's often flanked by these great lions, and she's a goddess who's actually worshipped in the city right the way through to the Christian period. So once pagan Byzantion and Byzantium becomes Christian Constantinople, Cybele is still there. She's still honoured in the city. As I said, a goddess absolutely not to be messed with, a goddess who represents the kind of extraordinary life-giving energy of the city. Another goddess who is worshipped, interestingly, in the Greek city is Hecate, again, who's a goddess who we think has Eastern origins. If I can just have the next slide, please. This is a coin of Hecate. And Hecate is a sort of goddess, sorceress, witch. She has magical powers, and she's always in charge of liminal places, so places which again are an entry point between one place and another. And of course this incredible city, this dynamic city of Istanbul, is nothing if not a great entry point and a crossroads for cultures. So Hecate was worshipped there too. She was worshipped, interestingly, with both dogs being dedicated to her sanctuary, live dogs, and dogs being sacrificed to her. And her coin, her symbol, was often used to be a symbol of Byzantium. You can see that on the coin here. It's a crescent moon and a star. And of course, that is still the symbol of the Turkish flag today. I should say it didn't come in a direct line from Hecate. It's a symbol that then is very popular in the East, is also used in the Byzantium in around the 1300s as a symbol. But there's a sort of connection between the very ancient world and the modern present of Turkey. So it's a city that matters. It's a city that is considered sacred. And really interestingly, nothing particularly exceptional happens there in sacred or religious terms, but people always kind of retrofit religious stories to kind of give Constantinople, Byzantium, Istanbul a kind of glow of spirituality. So it's a city that matters. It's well connected. It's strategic. And of course, the civilization who's going to notice that more than any other are the Romans, who decide that this is a city that they want for their own. So when they take over Greek territories, Byzantion becomes Byzantium and becomes a city that they're really, really fond of. Now, they're really fond of it because they know they can make a lot of money out of this city. Not only can armies be based there because it's so strategic, but they can tax people with a tariff when they come up and down the Bosphorus and the Golden Horn with their trades of fish. So it's a kind of cash cow for them. And for that reason, particularly later in the Roman Empire, it becomes considered actually a centrifugal and a central point of Rome. If we could just have the next slide, please. We're very used to the idea that Rome in the West, Rome in Italy, rises and then falls in 410, in the 5th century AD. It's a much more nuanced picture than that. Rome, in some ways, never really fell. It simply moved for 850 miles east to Istanbul. It's always been very important in the psyche and practically in the Roman story. And what you're looking at here looks like a rather uninspiring archaeological remain. This is probably one of the most important archaeological remains there is in the world. So just bear with me. This was the Milion. This was the mile marker in the center of what is now Istanbul. And it was set up by the Emperor Septimius Severus, who, of course, has connections with North Africa and the East. And this is the point from which all distances on Roman roads are measured. So it's sort of point zero for the idea of Roman civilization, and the roads are measured from then. And if you go and visit Istanbul today, which I would hugely recommend, go and have a look. It's got pointers to all points of the Roman imperial compass now. So just sort of think of that and what that means. That's incredible, isn't it? This is a city, as I said, that in the Roman mind is the very center of things. It's a center of commerce. It's the center of strategic power. And we see that to the power of X with the most brilliant recent archaeological discovery. If we could have the next slide, please, that would be great. So if you look at this, I just love this. This is one of the most amazing bits of archaeology I've ever seen in my life. So what you're looking at is a wooden ship. And this is a wooden ship that comes from the 4th century AD, from the Theodosian harbour, which has recently been excavated in Istanbul. Now, if you know anything about archaeology, you'll know it's very hard for organic remains to survive, but just look at the level of survival on this. It's quite incredible. And this is one of 37 whole ships that were discovered in excavations in Istanbul. So in Istanbul, because there's been a new tunnel, 2 new tunnels put under the Bosphorus for road and rail, and a new metro system in the city as well, there's a huge amount of rescue archaeology that's been done recently. And in the excavations here of the Theodosian harbour, I know there are 90,000 crates worth of material still being analysed and waiting to be analysed. So if there's anybody who's watching who fancies a job as an archaeologist, you could do far worse than train up and offer your services to Istanbul. So this boat is incredible because, again, it reminds us that in the late Roman world, the beginning of the medieval period, this city, Byzantium, Constantinople, was still incredibly important. And in that boat that you're looking at, were discovered remarkable things: a little basket of cherries, the naval captain's brazier on which he cooked his last meal, ship's rope, perfectly preserved. I've just been in Istanbul, as I've said, and I've been looking at the ship's rope, just incredible preservation. And a poor dog who was obviously the kind of ship's mascot, but who was clearly much loved because he's broken his front paw, and his front paw has been bound up again so that it's mended. But then the poor thing, we think that possibly some kind of tsunami activity brought that ship to the seabed, because kind of swirled into the ship's timbers are deep sands and seashells that shouldn't really be there. So it reminds us again that this is a city that sits on a fault line, that it's not just dynamic and full of brio and brilliance. It's also a city that has to deal with geographical and geological challenges, which gives it a kind of edgy energy too. If we could just have the next slide, please. So I love the fact that one of the things that was discovered in the cargo of the boats in Istanbul were huge amounts of these amphorae. And again, I'm sure some of the people listening to this will know that amphorae like that were full of wine. And Istanbul, Constantinople as it was then, was a city that really enjoyed its wine. It imported wine from all the kind of hot wine spots of the Greek world. Thassos, a lot of wine comes from Thassos, along with beautiful Thasian honey. And fantastic for us to see this archaeological evidence, because we've known in the historical record that Byzantium, Constantinople had a bit of a reputation for being a boozy place, a place that loved its drink. I'm just going to read you a couple of examples of that. And then we find that evidence in the archaeology. So this is written by Menander in the 4th century BCE. So this is when it was the Greek Byzantion. Byzantion makes all of her merchants drunkards. The whole night through, for your sake, we were drinking, and frankly, it was darn strong wine too. At any rate, I rose this morning with a head for 4. And again, a slightly more poetic version with the same message from Moero, who was a poetess of Byzantium. And really fascinatingly, and this is something I'm going to be talking about later, this is a city that seems to allow women to have a real place, a status and standing in society as well, right the way back to the Greek world. So this was written in the 3rd century BC by Moero, slightly more romantically. Cluster of grapes, full of the drops of Dionysus, you rest indeed under the cover of Aphrodite's golden chambers. No longer will your mother vine throw the beloved vine twig around you, spring forth the divine leaf over your head. Dionysus, we worship you. So this was a city that had a reputation as being a city that enjoyed its pleasures. And I don't know if any of you are familiar with the British town of Brighton on the coast. I always think medieval and late Roman Byzantium was a bit like Brighton. You know, there was a sort of lot of partying, a lot of drinking. You kind of feel that what happened in Byzantium stayed in Byzantium. And some people describe it as an armpit of a place. It's a place that you go and you have to kind of really watch out because it's so leery and hedonistic. But certainly a city that has a real sense of itself. It is, of course, a city that's boozy, but it's also a city that is blessed. It's too important not to have a kind of sacred aura around it. And the man who absolutely exploits that is the man who then gives the city of Byzantium its name, Constantinople, the Roman Emperor Constantine the Great. So there's a huge amount of power play towards the end of Rome. Constantine, there are 4 emperors. Constantine, I'm reducing a lot of history into a couple of sentences here, wins out and decides to make his new headquarters the city of Byzantium and to refound it as the city of Constantinople. And by the end of his reign, he's made it very clear that he has allegiance to the Christian faith. He's baptized on his deathbed. So suddenly this city has a new faith, and it's become a headquarters for the burgeoning, fledgling Christian faith. And so this is a game-changing, epoch-forming, history-making moment in the story of the world. If you go to Istanbul today, which, as I said, I would recommend, you can still see evidence of Constantine's reign everywhere. And if we could just have the next slide, please. One example is this lovely base of the column of Constantine, made of porphyry, this rich, beautiful purple imperial stone. And Constantine had this column erected. It's 115 feet high today. It was 160 feet originally, so it towered over the city. And atop it was a beautiful naked statue. Some said it was an image of the god Apollo. Some said it was an image of Christ. Some said an image of Constantine. I think it's sort of all of those things melded into one, and probably most likely the Roman imperial sun god, military sun god, Sol Invictus, the unconquerable sun. And what is fascinating about this incredible sculpture and statue, you can see, I think on the right-hand side of your screens, a reproduction of what the original statue would have looked like. This is kind of Constantine the Great, as often happens in the city, keeping all his options in play at once, because he is a ruler who's adopted Christianity, but he doesn't throw out the old pagan gods. So on that statue itself, we're told that the nails from the cross that Jesus was crucified on have been melded into the sun crown on the statue's head. If you go down the statue, underneath the base was said to be the very adze that Noah used to build the ark, and no less than the 5,000 panniers that Jesus used to feed the 5,000, so a whole lot of baskets wedged in there. And again, just to make sure that the old gods still gave their support to Constantine and his heirs. Also, we're told that under there was buried the Palladium, which is a beautiful statue of Pallas Athena that was said to have been stolen after the Battle of Troy from Aeneas and taken to Rome, and was then brought from Rome to Constantinople. So it's a kind of magpie culture. All religious power, Eastern and Western, Northern and Southern, ancient and at that time modern, is being pulled together in the city of Constantinople. So it's a city that is sacred. Also really fascinating for me, it's a city that has a great sense of solidarity. And I wonder why this is. I think there are 3 options. It could be that because it's a walled city, it's a city that is often besieged. So if you are besieged, you have to form a unity with the people around you. It could be that it's a city that is very seismic, as I said. So you kind of get this sense that as humans, you're matchsticks in the face of the power of Mother Nature. So your best allies are the other humans around you. Or really fascinatingly, it could be because it's a city that very early on adopted this sense of itself as a city of sanctuary, a city where if you came with an appropriate claim for asylum, you would be welcomed in and you would be looked after by the citizens of the city. Now this was something that was written into the laws of the city. So a quaestor, a late Roman official, was actually made the refugee officer of Constantinople. If you came to the gates of Constantinople, as I said, and if you had a good cause for asylum, then your voice had to be heard. And this is, again, something which continues as a sort of characteristic of the city right the way through to the modern period. As many of you will know, many hundreds of thousands, millions possibly, of Syrian refugees came to Istanbul and are still coming as a result of this terrible conflict in Syria. And that's happened as an unbroken line through the history of the city. If we could just have the next slide, please. I just had to show you this because I think it's so touching. These are young orphan Muslim children who were displaced in the lead up to World War I, and they were told that they could travel by themselves to the city of Istanbul, and they were housed in the great mosques of the city. So you can see this beautiful Ottoman period mosque and these children being looked after with their blankets around them. But I said it's something which happens throughout. So that people come to it from the east in the 11th century as refugees. At the fall of Granada, when Islamic Al-Andalus was taken over by Isabel and Ferdinand, large numbers of Muslims and Jewish families were allowed to come to the Ottoman city of Istanbul. They were welcomed in. Again, during World War I, a number of White Russians came to Istanbul as refugees. They brought with them, for instance, uncut money, uncut currency, which they used as tablecloths. And something which is rather underreported is that in the Second World War, Jewish families were given the passports of Muslim students, particularly from France, and were put on the train and were allowed to enter the city as Muslims. So were given refugee during the Nazi invasions of Europe. So it's a city which has always had this sense of a city of sanctuary, a city that welcomes people in. And the woman who, I'm delighted to say this, did this more than anybody else, is my great favorite from history, who I mentioned right at the beginning, the Empress Theodora. So if we could just have an image of the Empress Theodora, please. Now, Theodora, as I said, was the Empress of Byzantium in the 6th century AD. She died in the 540s AD. Oh my goodness, what a woman. So let me tell you the story of Theodora if you don't already know it. So Theodora was the daughter, we're told, of a bear tamer and a prostitute in the city of Constantinople. She was an acrobatic dancer, famous for her erotic dances and her gymnastics. Now, I'm not going to go into that on this lecture, and I'm not being coy, but do have a look if you want to at my book and other accounts of Theodora. You'll see she was said to be pretty fruity, pretty attractive, pretty out there in terms of the dances that she did. But she wasn't just attractive. She was obviously super smart. So as a teenager, she leaves the city. She basically kind of marries her way up a number of officials. She converts to Christianity. Her smartness is noticed, so she is approached to be an imperial spy. So she starts to sleep with men, not just for pleasure, not just for money, but for their secrets, and makes her way back to the court of Constantinople. And somehow, we can only imagine how, she attracts the attention of the soon-to-be emperor Justinian, and Justinian changes the law so that an emperor can marry an actress, in inverted commas, and the two of them wed. And they are the most remarkable medieval power couple. They are catnip to one another. This image that you're looking at of Theodora, this is one of the few images that we have her from a mosaic in Ravenna. And I think you can even tell from that, you know, what a feisty creature she is. She probably originated from Cyprus or Syria. She was described as having these kind of coal black flashing eyes, and her and Justinian embark on this really extraordinary reinvention of the city. They are trying to reinvent it as the old Roman Empire with all that power, but this is a city of social justice, and theirs is an empire that it's by no means perfect. There are persecutions, you know, there is slavery, there's all the appalling stuff of the medieval world, but they are trying in some instances to improve the lives of some. And Theodora, really fascinatingly, seems to support Justinian in a number of reforms aimed at supporting particularly vulnerable women, which she has been in her life. So there are increased penalties for rape and infanticide and pimping. Theodora sets up in Istanbul a safe house for single mothers and fallen women, prostitutes. There are large numbers of reforms that are instituted to encourage social justice. And Justinian here is building on reforms that were brought in by Constantine the Great, where the poor of the city had to be fed 80,000 a day, were given a bread or a grain ration. Even in Constantine's time, the poor, there were taxes on workshops so that the poor would always be given a decent and honourable funeral. So they really kind of expand this notion that this is a city of social justice, and, as I said, a city that can offer sanctuary to refugees. And we know this from Theodora because there's a brilliant bit of historical evidence from a builder who's basically complaining, who's adapting Theodora's palace. And he says, look, there are so many refugees that she welcomes into the palace itself, not to some kind of camp on the edge of the city, but into the palace, that the floor is breaking and I'm having to mend the floor again and again. So she is an empress who really puts her money where her mouth is. And also an empress that understands that this is a city that is hyper connected. And Justinian and Theodora are really try to again reanimate that sort of hyper connectivity of the old Roman Empire, right the way out to the very edges of empire, including my homeland of Britain. So if we could just have the next slide, please. What you're looking at here is an image of the beautiful headland of Tintagel in Cornwall. If any of you know your myths, you'll know that this is where the mysterious King Arthur was supposed to have held his court. And there's a direct connection between Byzantium and Tintagel. So a lot of trading missions are sent out there. You can just see on that on the image there are some ships, and some ships we know came all the way from Constantinople. And rather brilliantly, Justinian and Theodora say that they are going to give subsidies to the barbarians of Britannia because they know that we're such a sort of poor, wet, helpless country at this point that they need to subsidize us and back us up. But they also keep both diplomatic and trade relations going. And on that headland alone, that tiny headland in salt, windswept North Cornwall, there was a bushfire in the 1980s, which exposed some of those buildings that you can see on the image. And these were workshops and depots for international trade. And only 10% of that has been excavated so far. And in that 10%, there is more Byzantine pottery fragments than there are anywhere else in Western Europe. So again, just do the maths on that. That tells you what an extraordinary level of trade there was between Constantinople and, the edges of Empire Britain. And we see this again in other ways. If we could just have the next slide, please. What you're looking at here is a beautiful necklace that would be worn by an Anglo-Saxon queen this was discovered in Desborough in the 19th century. But if you look at that and you compare it to the beautiful sort of ocean fat pearls and gems that Theodora is wearing in her Ravenna mosaic and other Byzantine jewelry, you'll see that the women of Anglo-Saxon England were basically trying to ape what was going on in Constantinople, to saying, look at us, we can be as smart as any Constantinople noblewoman. And again, just another little tiny bit of new archaeological evidence. If you could just put the next slide up, please. These are coins from the site of Rendlesham, which is very close to the famous Sutton Hoo ship burial. So we're talking about the kind of northeast of England. And these coins were minted in Byzantium, and they were discovered in such huge numbers that we know this isn't just a kind of exotic hoard that was buried, that this was being used as some form of currency. So this is a hyper-connected city, a city that reaches out right the way, as I said, to the kind of wind-blown, desolate reaches of Britain in the 6th and 7th and 8th centuries AD, CE. Next slide, please. So it's a city that matters. I just want to show you this beautiful image, which is a reconstruction of the city in the 10th century. How cool does it look? It looks like we'd imagine kind of Renaissance Florence or something to look. And it's a city that is a jewel, but jewels attract thieves. So at this point, it's being besieged a number of times by Arab navies and armies. Before the Ottomans take over, there are a number of Muslim-facing armies who try to take the city. It's also attacked by the Vikings. Now, the Vikings have a kind of love-hate relationship with Istanbul. They try to attack it, they try to invade, they're repelled by Greek fire, but they love the silk that it produces. And Byzantium was famous for its silk, particularly its purple silk. And the Vikings could not get enough of this. So again, it sort of just makes you kind of rethink the story of the world. So the Vikings used to use purple silk sometimes for their sails from Byzantium. Hilariously, the Byzantines sort of sold them off the kind of cheap grade material as if it was the wealthiest. It's like giving somebody tea bags and saying it's the highest grade tea. And Vikings would often wear purple silk scarves, again made in Byzantium, a rather sort of different image. And at a point when the relationships between them were good, Vikings were allowed to enter the city as long as they came in at one particular gate, only 50 at a time, and promised not to rape and pillage when they got in the city, and they were welcomed in by Byzantine officials. So it's a city that, as I said, that's always been connected at all points of the compass, but it's destined not to survive. And one of the kind of grubbiest, most awful moments in the story of Istanbul comes in 1204 with the Fourth Crusade, when the attack doesn't come from Vikings, it doesn't come from Arab armies, it comes from people who are supposed to be allies of the city, Christian crusaders. And yeah, you know, I as you can tell, you know, it's a very upsetting time in the story of world, this, because people inside Constantinople think that the Christian armies outside them are their brothers. They can see the Red Crusader crosses painted on their shirts and flags. But the invading Frankish armies, many of whom were illiterate, see this glittering, well-stocked, beautiful city, and again manage to persuade themselves with a clever bit of kind of anti-theology, really, that they are the wrong kinds of Christians, and therefore they can attack. And the Fourth Crusade, the attack of Constantinople in 1204, is a truly brutal affair. And again, I just want to give you a little bit of the evidence from that. So this was a time when, as I said, many of the Western Frankish invaders are illiterate, but almost everybody, including women, read and wrote in Constantinople, and they tell us what happened. Tearing children from mothers and mothers from children, treating the Virgin with wanton shame in holy chapels, viewing with fear neither the wrath of God nor the vengeance of men, the Crusaders, in the name of God, destroyed much of what they found in their path. So they burn manuscripts and parchments, they rip jewels out of icons, they tear the metal strips that have held up that column of Constantinople off and melt down the metal. They steal huge numbers of ancient statuary which had been brought into Constantinople from across the ancient world, and again either remove it. So the famous horses of St. Mark's were originally decorating the hippodrome in the centre of Constantinople. And I think really this destroys the kind of mojo of the city. It does recover. The Byzantines come back in 1261. There is a kind of flourishing of culture there in the 14th century, but it's never really quite the same. It's sort of lost its sense of itself as this extraordinary, invincible city. So we should think of Istanbul when it's or Constantinople, when it's a city which is taken over by the Ottomans in 1453, of course, the great siege of Mehmet the Conqueror, Mehmet II. It's a city that's already mortally wounded. And again, although in the history books this siege is described as this kind of out of the blue invasion, the Ottomans have taken over all the land around Constantinople by this time, many of the territories both to the east and to the west, and it's just the city itself, this kind of island, which is the last to fall. And when Mehmet takes over, again there is devastation and slaughter and atrocities, as there always are on the taking over of a city. But there are also continuities. I think we should never forget that the Ottoman sultans called themselves Caesars. They were the inheritors of the Roman title of this city. And the sultans there very quickly try to sort of prove that they are Renaissance princes, that these are very cultured men who have the same tastes as many of their European and North African counterparts. So they translate the Iliad and the Odyssey and other great works. And one of my favourite examples of this is when one particular sultan sets up a bridge building competition for bridges over the Golden Horn, puts out a kind of call for architects to submit. And one of the architects who submits, if we could just have the next slide, please, is no less than Leonardo da Vinci himself. You know, not a bad name to conjure with. And what you're looking at here is an image of the notebook of Leonardo da Vinci with his sketch of the bridge that he was going to build over the Golden Horn. See the little boat going underneath it, and fantastically translated into Ottoman Turkish. We even have the letter that he wrote asking if he could build the bridge, which was just, it's in the archives in Istanbul. I don't think Leonardo had a problem with ego, and just listen to his letter he wrote. I, your servant, have heard that you intended to construct a bridge from Istanbul to Galata, but you could not because no expert could be found. I, your servant, I know how to make it. I could raise an arch so high that nobody would want to pass over it because of its height. I could construct it in such a way that even a sailing ship should pass under it. So, you know, there is Leonardo saying, basically, don't worry, I'm here. And the Sultan goes, Leonardo, who? And doesn't give him the gig. But it's just one example of, I said, the sort of magnet it was for the great artists and architects of the day, including, of course, the extraordinary architect Sinan, who was truly a genius and whose buildings still last in the beautiful modern city of Istanbul. If we could just have a look at the next slide, please. This is the wonderful Süleymaniye Mosque, and what you can see here is that incredible dome. Sinan put into the roof of the dome inverted amphorae, and there were over 200 of these, so they acted as a kind of Helmholtz resonator for the sound of the prayers being said in the mosque. So, and I give you that example just once again, just to show you what an incredibly ambitious and progressive city it was. It's a city that sponsored advances of all kinds. And again, if we can just have the next slide. So this is the Kilik Ali Pasha Hammam attached to the Kilik Ali Pasha Mosque, again a building of Sinan, a beautiful hammam which is open to the public again. And when that was being renovated, we realized that Sinan developed a kind of plaster, a special kind of plaster to coat the inside of the hammam building, so that both the health of the bathers inside and the health of the building could be preserved. And that was discovered after scraping down 42 layers of historical accretion. So it's a city that welcomes inspiration and talent from all points of the compass. A city, as I said, that always has a kind of brio. And I can't believe I've only got 5 minutes left. I can't believe I've only got 5 minutes to talk to you about the Ottoman phase of the city. Maybe I'll come back and we can have a whole session on the Ottomans. But just because the time is so short, I just have to talk to you about the women of the Ottoman culture of Istanbul. As I've said, through time, right from from the classical period onwards, really interestingly, it does seem to have been a city that for some reason women felt that they could express themselves. And this continues through into the Ottoman world. And if we could just have the next slide, please. So what you're looking at here, of course, is the famous harem of Istanbul. This is a watercolor from the early 18th century. On the left, you can see the so-called black eunuch who was in charge of the harem. And although Western appropriation of the idea of the harem has turned it into a sort of lascivious place where women are sort of drifting around half naked and oiling each other or washing together, this is very much how the harem is represented in 18th, 19th and early 20th centuries, 20th century paintings. The harem was part of the court, just as any section of a European palatial culture would have its court. There is no doubt that these women were brought in as slaves, and for some it was the most appalling experience. You ended up right at the bottom of the pile as a slave of slaves. TB was rife in the harem. In fact, a number of sultans we know contracted TB from the harem, and there was a terrible restriction on freedom. So these women could be both princesses and slaves. And yet, We also know that women, parents would write begging for their daughters to enter the harem, because it was considered a great honor, and they were safe here, safer than they would have been in the outlying villages. A number of women went there for 9 years or so, and then won their freedom and entered into society to be married. And because in Islam women can inherit, a number of the women in the harem had disposable cash that they could use to sponsor artworks and great engineering works. And so there's this incredible fact that if you look at the historical skyline of Istanbul today, around 50% of those Ottoman period buildings have been sponsored or paid for by women of the imperial harem. So there's a kind of really interesting kind of subtle thing going on here. And the women of the harem were considered so potent that some described it as a sultanate of women. And the Valide, the mother of the sultan, was probably the most powerful female at that time in history. And diplomats who go to Istanbul are very annoyed because they have to go through these women. They describe them as mediatrixes. You have to go through the women to get the ear of the Sultan. But the women, they're sorting out diplomatic affairs themselves. They're making decisions on international questions. They seem to have real influence in the court, particularly in the absence of the Sultan. And this is shown no better than by a wonderful letter from one member of the harem called Safiye, and her name means pleasing one. She was taken probably age 13 or so from a village in Albania, and ended up being a favourite in the court, and then again a mother. And she writes to no less than Elizabeth I, the Queen of England. And this is her letter in 1593. So the two have already engaged in sort of competitive gift giving, showing how rich they are. They exchange cats and embroidered towels and carriages. And then this is what she writes. So it's basically Safiye saying, I've got your back, and I'm getting the things done that you've asked me to get done in diplomatic and high political terms. I can repeatedly mention Her Highness's gentility and praise at the foot dust of His Majesty, the Sovereign who has Alexander's place. So very interesting that the Sultan is thought to have taken over from Alexander the Great, again a kind of classical reference. I shall endeavour for your aims, so I'll try and get done what you want me to do. I think this was actually a particular issue of the capture of pirates on the Barbary coast, and she wants to get them released. Your letter has arrived and reached us. God willing, action will be taken according to what you said. May we always be firm in friendship. God willing, may our friendship never die. And so they basically sort of sorted out international affairs. And then there's the most fantastic PS, because it's two women, dare I say, who've got a great relationship. They start to exchange makeup tips. On account of your Majesty's being a woman, I hear there are to be found in your kingdom rare distilled waters of every kind for the face, and odoriferous oils for the hands. Or your Majesty would favour me by sending some of them to me by my hand, because she realises she doesn't want them to go to other people in the harem. For this most serene queen, by my hand, as being articles for ladies, she does not wish them to pass through other hands. So I just love that. And that's where I'm going to end today. This incredible postscript from a potent woman within the Ottoman harem to the Queen of England, Elizabeth I. And it seems to me that encapsulates, as I say, the kind of brio and brilliance of Istanbul, the fact that it's a city that allows people of all degrees to try to achieve their potential, women as well as men, a city that is connected at all points of the compass, and a city which, as I said, has been described as the greatest city on earth, the queen of cities, the world's desire, the threshold. Somebody said that this was a city that was a virgin that had enjoyed many husbands, and Napoleon, no less, said that if the world were one country, then Istanbul would be its capital. So it is a city that matters. But for me, why it matters, it's a city that understands that we can only thrive if we communicate across borders and boundaries, and if we welcome other influences, other people, other ideas in. And that is what makes a healthy city. The man who coined the phrase cosmopolitan and cosmopolis right the way back in antiquity almost certainly passed through what was then Byzantium. And for me, Istanbul is great for many reasons, but it's great because it is the incarnation of a cosmopolitan city. Because if you understand the Greek meaning of cosmopolitan, it means a city that is connected to the world, and cosmopolitans are world cities. So I love Istanbul. I hope that you get the chance to go and visit it, because it is a city that teaches us that at our very best, we are all indeed world citizens. Thank you very much.
Well, what a privilege for us to hear this exclusive Ramsay Centre lecture from Professor Bettany Hughes. And on behalf of all our listeners, Bettany, warmest thanks to you. I was actually born in Turkey myself, and my parents took me to Istanbul numerous times as a child. So this has been an especial pleasure for me, as I'm sure it has for everyone who's been there or read about it. Thank you for listening. Please join us again soon. This is Simon Haynes saying goodbye for now.